If Havana, Cuba is on your cruise itinerary, but you're not too sure what to expect, stick around because I'm going to be sharing my thoughts from my port stay in Havana earlier this year, along with a couple of tips to ensure you have a great experience. Hi, I'm Bev and welcome to my channel where I invite you to join me on my travels and adventures as a semi-retired postmenopausal businesswoman with ADHD, entering what I like to call my butterfly years. So my husband Mark and I took a Caribbean cruise on the Marella Discovery II earlier this year, and one of the itinerary items on our cruise was an overnight port stop in Havana, Cuba. And in this video I'm going to be showing you around the city and sharing with you our initial thoughts, what we loved, what we didn't like so much, lessons we learned, and whether or not we thought it was a good place to visit. And stick around because I'll also be sharing a tip or two around how to avoid being taken for a ride, quite literally. Okay, so we arrived in Havana Port around 9 AM and we'd booked a walking tour of the old city through our cruise line TUI. I'm sure you could do it cheaper yourself, but we're still pretty new to cruising and just felt more comfortable booking with the cruise company. I think as we get more confident, we'll either book in advance through maybe a third-party tour company, or maybe we'll even find a tour company at the port, but we were quite happy booking the way we did for now. Getting off through the port was a bit of a faff as we had to go through some quite strict bag searches and security, both leaving the ship and arriving back at the ship, and then we still had the usual security to get onto the ship. But to be fair, it didn't really take too long. The port had a few shops selling things like cigars and liquor and Havana merch, including some great traditional percussion instruments like maracas and wooden hitty things, which I'm sure have got a proper name, but I don't know what they are. We met our tour guide down some stairs heading out of the port, and there were around 20 or so of us on our particular tour. Our guide was great. He spoke really good English and he was easy to understand. He probably wasn't the funniest or the most dynamic tour guide we've ever had, but he was definitely easy to listen to and very interesting. He took us around lots of sites in the old town and we visited cigar shops and Cuban rum stores. The pace was good and we had a little bit of free time to explore the fort area before regrouping and continuing our tour. I managed, thankfully, to get quite a lot of video footage and photographs, and there were some rather weird bits of artwork, including this woman riding a chicken and this chap, who turned out not to be a statue after all, but a bloke dressed up, which I didn't realise until we headed back and the statue had disappeared. You probably wondered why I didn't give him a tip. Our tour guide was really quietly spoken and he had absolutely no chance of being heard over the top of some stilt dancers who made a very loud appearance about midway through our tour and just seemed to be following exactly the same route that we were. Our tour finished off with a visit to a bar where we were all given a mojito, which, to be honest, wasn't all that great. They didn't have enough outside tables and chairs for us all, which resulted in a couple of us standing and the bar staff looking pretty annoyed at having to bring the inside tables outside so we could have a seat. This took a good while and it meant that while we were waiting, by the time we got our drink and our seat, the next tour group had arrived and we were asked to move on. So it just all felt a little bit not very relaxing. The whole tour took around 2 hours, which was plenty, as it was starting to get a bit hot, although in reality the weather in Cuba was a lot cooler than it had been on the rest of our Caribbean cruise, which was quite a nice relief, especially as we did a lot of walking. It wasn't overly hot, but we were definitely getting to the point where we probably needed to sit down and have a bit of a rest. We felt it was good value for money as it only cost around £30 each. Mark and I then thought we'd see if we could get a tour in one of the many old classic cars that were cruising constantly up and down the main drag. We hadn't booked a car tour because when we had tried before we set sail, unfortunately the TUI app showed that there were no excursion spaces available, but we knew we could just book them on the spot, so we weren't too worried. And this is where we learned our first lesson. Make sure you take plenty of American dollars in cash. Nearly every port we visited on this cruise accepted payment by card, but not Havana. Here it was pretty much cash only. The ATMs only gave Cuban currency, which you're not able to exchange back home into sterling or dollars. And the car drivers, of course, only took cash too. We'd taken some dollars with us, but not enough, and when we tried to buy dollars on our cruise ship, we found out that we couldn't buy with our card, we would have had to buy them in cash. Annoyingly, we didn't take any pounds or sterling with us either, so we weren't able to get dollars at all. You know, the cars make the city feel like you've been transported back in time to the 1950s America. And apparently after the Cuban Revolution, Castro banned American cars and any mechanical parts from being imported. These old cars are kept running with makeshift parts and engines cannibalised from other cars, often Russian larders, which you will also see plenty of. You'll also see funny little three-wheeled yellow vehicles called cocoa taxis. These half coconut-shaped cabs, hence where they get their name, are considered to be pretty dangerous though, and there have been some fairly serious accidents, so you pays your money, you takes your chance. Anyway, since we had no cash and weren't able to book a classic car ride or any other kind of taxi ride for that matter, we decided instead to just have a walk around some of the places we'd already seen, having a look again, finishing off using our very last few dollars to buy a beer in one of the lovely old squares where we watched the world and those damned stilt walkers go by. By now we were getting pretty hot and tired and hungry, but as we'd used our very limited cash to buy a couple of beers, we decided to head back to the ship to grab something to eat and get changed before we headed out later in the day for our second excursion in Havana. As we headed back through the port, we took the opportunity to pick up a couple of gifts to take home, and I'm sure my daughter was really pleased with the wooden hitty things we bought for our granddaughter. Later that evening, we got our glad rags on and we set off for the port terminal again, this time to grab a coach that would take us to the Parisienne for a fabulous Cuban cabaret, complete with lots of singing, drumming and ridiculously large shirt sleeves. The Parisienne is located within the Hotel Nacional de Cuba, and it's kind of the smaller second cousin to the famous Club Tropicana, which was also an option, but as we'd left it too late, we could only get tickets for Parisienne. But it was good and we didn't feel like we'd been disappointed. Included in the tour was the coach journeys there and back, the show, and also a glass of mojito. We were glad we'd eaten on the ship as it was a late start, with the show not getting going until around 9:30 and finishing about midnight. It was definitely an experience and felt again like we'd travelled back in time to maybe the 1930s. The venue felt like an old jazz club and we were packed in like sardines really tightly, and the waiters were constantly buzzing around serving drinks and food, and you could certainly order more drinks and food if you wanted to, but I think most of us stuck with just our one mojito. The majority of the show is in Spanish, although there is a little bit of English, but it's quite hard to understand. The quality of the dancing and the singing though was fantastic, and the venue felt cosy and intimate. And the Parisienne boasts some well-known former visitors, including Winston Churchill and Frank Sinatra, to name just a couple. You will need to be appropriately dressed. There's no shorts, t-shirts or flip-flops for either men or women, and guys, you can't wear your sandals, not even if you wear your white sports socks with it, sorry. We actually docked overnight in Havana, which meant we had another opportunity to visit the city the following day. We needed to be back on board for sail away by around, I think, 1:30 p.m, if I remember rightly. So after breakfast, on day 2, we decided to take an open top, hop on, hop off bus ride around Havana, which stopped just outside of the port. I can't for the life of me remember for sure, but I'm fairly certain we must have been able to buy the tickets by card, because I'm fairly certain our last few dollars went on our Cuban beer the day before. Anyway, I do know it wasn't expensive. If I recall, it was about £10 or $10 per person. And it was a great way to see the city and a complete eye-opener, as you really got to experience what Havana looks like away from the sanitised touristy bits. The levels of poverty you see in the residential areas are in stark contrast with the beautifully renovated old Havana buildings and the modern commercial buildings. And from the top deck of the bus, it's a great place to view the Castillo de los Tres Reyes del Moro, standing proud at the entrance to Havana Harbour. And of course to see the huge images of Che Guevara and Camilo Cienfuegos, often mistaken as being Fidel Castro, in Revolution Square. Although we did seem to drive past Revolution Square about 3 times on this one bus trip. The whole trip takes around an hour and a half, and although you can get on and off at different stops, we didn't, as we weren't sure how soon the next bus would arrive, and we knew our time was limited and we didn't want to risk missing our back on board time. Sadly, the commentary was pretty useless. We couldn't hear, and the English was so poor we really couldn't understand. And there aren't any headsets on the bus, there's no recorded commentary, so we didn't even bother trying to hear what was being said. I'd still say though that it was well worth doing, and it's so cheap, and it's a great way to pass an hour and a half. So there you go. Did we think Havana was a good place to include in our itinerary? Yes, absolutely. We loved the vibrancy of the old town and the quirkiness of the city. Would we want to spend longer there? I'm not sure. I have no doubt that there were lots of things we didn't see, but I did feel we'd got a good enough flavour of Havana from the time we had. And that's not to say we wouldn't want to visit other parts of Cuba, but in all honesty, the currency issue was a bit of a pain. So to summarise then the lessons that we learned. Actually, it was mainly just to make sure that we had a good amount of cash, American dollars, so we'd have more flexibility to do more things. We also definitely learned that while it's not the best hop-on, hop-off bus tour we've ever done, it was definitely an easy and cheap way to really get to know Havana. If we were going to go back, we'd possibly try to make sure we could get tickets for Club Tropicana rather than the Parisienne, as the feedback we heard from other guests who'd been to Club Tropicana definitely tapped into my FOMO. And we'd definitely suggest you think about doing a guided walking tour. Whether you book it in advance through a third-party company or through the cruise line, doesn't really matter. We learnt so much more than we'd have been able to learn if we tried to do it ourselves, and it really wasn't very expensive. Now, if you're enjoying this video or finding it helpful, I'd love you to give it a thumbs up. And if you're interested in future content as I share my butterfly years, ping the subscribe button and the bell so you get notified when I post. Okay, now I did promise at the start that I'd share a couple of lessons that we've since learned where other people have been ripped off and felt pretty vulnerable. I have to be honest and say that these are third or even possibly fourth hand accounts of what happened, but I thought I'd share it here so hopefully you won't get caught out. I know I feel happier knowing what to look out for in case we ever do go back. The first story was from a couple who were on our cruise. They'd negotiated a price for a 60-minute ride in one of those classic oldie taxis. Apparently the driver had asked if they'd like to see a famous cafe in a local park where they'd be able to get a drink to cool down. They said yes, as they thought it would be included in the hour. When they got to the cafe, the driver apparently left them with their drinks while he went off for a very long chat with some of his mates before coming back and finishing off their tour. Now the whole tour, because of the stop at the cafe, actually lasted about 2 hours instead of the 60 minutes that they thought they'd agreed to. and apparently he wouldn't let them get out of the car until they stumped up for the full 2 hours rather than just one. Now maybe there was a breakdown in communication, perhaps language barriers got in the way, who knows, but it's worth being aware that any extras being suggested in your trip may also mean an extra high fee at the end of it. And the other story I heard was actually after we'd got back from some people talking in a Marella Discovery II Facebook group that I'm a member of. And they said they'd heard of a group of women who'd been enticed into a bar to try some authentic Cuban mojitos, but they were landed with a bill for around $70 each for their drink and were locked in until they paid their bill, obviously feeling very scared and vulnerable. Now, of course, I cannot say with 100% certainty A, that this actually happened, or B, that there haven't been some Chinese whispers at play in the retelling of the story. But it's definitely worth staying alert and not putting yourself in a position where you might be exploited or feel vulnerable. So there you go. A quick look at Havana through our eyes. Let me know in the comments, have you been to Havana? And if so, what was your impression of it? And if you haven't, let me know if it's on your cruise plans for the future. Now, if you're interested in seeing more about our Marella Discovery II experience, check out this video where I'm sharing our embarkation day, wacky racers style ride through Montego Bay and giving you a look around a standard ocean view cabin. See you soon.